Welcome to the Data Product Management in Action podcast, created and executive produced by me, Scott Hirleman, and brought to you by Soda, your best friend in data quality and contracts tooling. We created this podcast to serve as a place for actual practitioners bringing product management practices to data, whether that is to AI and ML, data products, platforms, or everything else in data, right? And it's to dig into the nitty-gritty of product management in data, but in fun and dynamic conversations. It's not just lift and shift from software product management. We have a great set of hosts for you that are also practitioners, so they can really get into those specifics and dive deep and get you the information you want to know rather than just high level, here is what a data product is. This is about cutting through the noise of data product management to drive towards actionable insights, hence the actual podcast name, Data Product Management in Action. So sit back and enjoy another awesome conversation.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Data Product Management in Action. My name is Nick Zerviudis and I'm your host for today. And I'm joined by Theo Bell. Theo, hi, how are you?
I'm great, thanks. How are you?
Super good. Looking forward to the holidays, but even more looking forward to our conversation. Theo was one of the very first members of London's Data Product Management Meetup, and that's how we met. And we've had so many interesting discussions at the meetup that I've been really looking forward to, I guess, having one that we can share with the rest of the world as well. So why don't we start off, just tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, what's your origin story, how did you get to where you are today?
Yeah, sure. I grew up in Eastern Canada and studied mechanical engineering. And then I thought I wanted to be a professor. So I came to the UK to do a PhD. And then I realized that just sitting in a room by myself all the time, thinking about what problems I was going to work on wasn't really that exciting. I wanted to work with people. And my boyfriend at the time said, you should apply to an investment bank. And I thought that's a strange thing to do, but do they want engineers? Turns out they did. So I went there and I worked at Goldman Sachs in the equities electronic trading business for 7 or 8 years. Before I sort of grew bored of the big sort of corporate culture and playing the promotion game and things like that. And then I went to a company called Palantir, which is it was a startup, I guess, many, many years ago. It's been around since 2008, I think. And what they have is a sort of data platform for integrated decision making, and it's very much sort of operational decisions, and it's all about sort of empowering people to make decisions with data. And I really, really enjoyed my time there. Got to work across many different industries, from finance to manufacturing, to the NHS, to Ministry of Defense. But basically, I saw over and over again the same sort of patterns. Was that like a lot of people have data, but they don't have a data model. Yeah, so that's sort of when I got excited about this idea of empowering people to make decisions with data. Because so many companies have data, lots of different silos, possibly from just different tech stacks over the years or acquisitions or something. But if you really believe that you can put all this data in one place and sort of integrate it into that sort of ontology or data model, you can then actually do some really, really neat things, sort of connecting the back of your business to the front of the business. So one example we had with a manufacturer company at Palantir was during COVID, there was a lot of raw material shortages because of issues in China and things like that. And what they were able to do was figure out, based on the incoming delays of the raw materials, which client orders they wanted to potentially slow down or cancel. And that was really connecting the procurement side of their business all the way through the production process, through the bill of materials and everything, being able to then make a business decision to say, we want to prioritize client X over client Y or something like that. And that was a super cool example of like connecting like the whole value chain using this ontology.
That's super cool. I find it really funny. Anytime I meet someone who works in data, but they very much came from the business they were in and kind of laterally stumbled onto data, and they start describing their problems and how data sets are siloed and it's all patched together from different systems. And then as I kind of fill in the gaps for them, like, oh, let me guess, you've got siloed teams, siloed data, siloed ways of working. And they're like, oh my God, how did you know? Because they think that their situation is totally unique and everyone else must have it figured out and be totally data driven. And then you're like, nope, it's a very familiar story.
Yeah, I think literally every client I ever worked with is like, you've probably never seen it this bad. And I'm like, no, trust me, I have. Everybody has the same problem, right?
Like that's one of the things I really like about our meetup, because sometimes we just come in to vent about a situation and you think, oh my God, I'm having this very frustrating situation right now. And then everyone else kind of nods along. Maybe you hear some examples of other situations being even more, let's say, chaotic, and kind of realize, okay, we're sort of all in this together, or at least that misery loves company. But tell me a little bit more about how you've kind of transcended that misery, like that connected platform. What I'm curious, what did that look like in terms of I guess, convincing the organization to start working in that way? Not necessarily how were things all rosy and flowery by the end, but what was the starting point? Was it a big platform type investment that, oh, we need to build super solid foundations, or was it more one use case at a time when you did it with that manufacturing client?
Yeah, I mean, it's a super interesting question because I think in order to have the vision of connecting all those different parts of the business, you have to sort of be somebody whose incentives are in line with doing that, right? And typically what we observed was that there was very few people at a big organization whose job it was to think that way, right? And so, we would often get into a company through the CEO because they would recognize that, they had this problem and that they could totally see the value of being able to do these kinds of trade-offs. But then when you went to go, for instance, you might start with a use case. And I think that's a really important thing, right? It's like, you don't really want to try to sort of like do this boil the ocean approach of like bringing all the data in and spending 5 years getting the perfect data model and then tackle the use cases, right? Like, I think where I've seen it be most successful is very much when you start with a potentially even narrow use case, but with that sort of global vision in mind, so that you're not sort of building just like a POC. It's more like a sort of pilot, something that is production ready, but you can scale up later. Um, and you can deliver value quickly to get some of that buy-in that you need. But, it was always very hard to sort of convince the person in procurement who's looking for a procurement software, and they're used to spending, relatively small amounts of money buying software that solves a particular problem and trying to convince them. But yeah, if we do this, the people, on the client servicing side of it can also use it. And they're like, well, why? I don't care about that. Like, my job is procurement, right? Um, so there was a lot of sort of stakeholder alignment that had to be done. And that's the same thing I'm experiencing right now at Rhymes, because we're also sort of building this model of our business as well, which I want to use to sort of help better serve our clients, reduce our cost to serve, and ultimately, I guess, help our company be more valuable to the next round of investors as well. Because if you have this sort of model of your business, you can ask some really cool what if questions, right? Like, what if we were to, double the amount of, data partners that we worked with or something like that? How do we think that might impact the revenue, or different things like that? So you get this really powerful tool to the business. But as I was saying, there's very few people whose job it is to think that way. And another interesting sort of nuance we often observed when working with clients at Palantir was that, we would often enable some sort of workflow that had never been possible before, and therefore there was not anybody in the business to actually do that job. Even though sort of when you looked at it, you're like, this is a really obvious problem that we should be solving, but because they couldn't ever solve it before, there was nobody who had that job title who was, being trained or incentivized or in the position to actually click the buttons. So it's very interesting. I think that you have to sort of have organizational change alongside your technology change, if you actually want to sort of create business value.
Well, I'm trying to decide which bit of all of that to start first. I guess going to what you said at the beginning, and I love this as an insight that it's not just about you need a compelling business case, but also there needs to be someone on the receiving end that sees things in that way, and that actually what is good for their organization is maybe selfishly good for them too. So the CEO is a great example of that. How To what extent would you say that, for example, to convince that person in procurement, you had to just point to the person 5 levels above them and be like, well, look, Theo wants it done this way, versus, I guess, like appease them with short-term benefits to them and say, and also in the future, it'll be beneficial because we'll have a more connected environment and, uh, get those economies of scale. Like what was it that convince those individual stakeholders? Was it the carrot or the stick or both?
Yeah, I think it's mostly carrot, I think, for me anyway. Like, I tend to, I guess people often had sort of very limited vision in terms of like what they thought that the platform could do, or that what they thought they could do with their data effectively. And sometimes they would get you to like reporting use cases are some of my least favorite, because they don't really add any value to the business, right? Like, it needs to be done for sure, and if you can do it with fewer humans than you're doing today, like there's some savings there, but it's not the kind of thing that sort of becomes more valuable over time, right? It probably, if anything, becomes less valuable over time. But we would often have to start with those reporting use cases, because when you ask somebody what's your hardest problem, they didn't always necessarily trust you with their hardest problem, because you hadn't proven anything to them, but also they wanted to sort of give you something small to start with. And so you would often have to do their, relatively low value use case first, just sort of prove to them that you could do it. But along the side, I would always be sort of like adding in, enriching the data, the object views with like other interesting stuff, or like connecting bits that they maybe hadn't asked to be connected to, but just to sort of start to show them the power of like, yeah, we could just do reporting, but what if, rather than making a dashboard, you actually had somebody that could take an action. So like more of an operational workflow, right? And that could involve writing back to the source system, or it could just be something that, you manage within the platform itself. And in this case, the platform was the Palantir Foundry. Because ultimately your business is no different if somebody looks at a dashboard. Like, if they don't make an action on the back of looking at that, then nothing has changed. And if they're going to make an action on the back of it, why not make them able to do it right in the platform, right where they saw that, right where they had that insight? And I think that's the sort of thing that it becomes much easier to demo it, I think, than it is to sort of sell it ahead of time. So like, I would rather sort of show the proof of concept, and then people are like, oh yes, okay, I get this kind of thing. And that was sort of what I did at Rhymes. Like, I got access to the free trial that Palantir now offers, and I built a little thing, and I showed my boss, and he was like, oh, okay, now I get this kind of thing. Because it's really, I mean, maybe it's just I struggle, but I think in general it's sort of very hard to articulate just how powerful it could be to do this sort of thing.
I totally agree. And for me, it's something I apply all the time. I kind of call it seek forgiveness, not permission, though that makes it sound almost like it's something naughty. But at the end of the day, especially if you're coming as an expert in data to someone that's an expert in their business, but not in the more transformational things you can do beyond reporting, you kind of need to show them for it to kind of come to life in their minds. That's why sometimes for me, it might be as simple as sketch something on a piece of paper or a PowerPoint slide, like a mock-up of a new process, of a new dashboard, of a new way of taking a decision, instead of just talking about it and it's not feeling real, or even better, an interactive prototype.
Yes, but also it's an interesting point though. So there was once when I did this sort of I guess it was a product design sort of mini boot camp kind of thing, and we were given access to some users. I think they were in the recruiting team, whatever. They gave us a problem, and our job was to sort of sketch up a solution. And in our team, we didn't have anybody who knew how to use. I think it was Sketch at the time we were using, and so we did it on a big piece of paper, and we really felt like we had the inferior proposal to the other team. But what was really powerful about going to somebody with a piece of paper was you could give them the pen, and they could be like, well, no, it wasn't what I had in mind. I was more thinking we might project it like this kind of thing. And so we got much more input from them, because they could actually be part of the process. But also, when you come with sort of like a shiny prototype, people don't want to insult your work, right? Whereas if it's like, it's just roughly sketched up on a piece of paper, it's like, no, this is just my idea, and like, I'm here to get your feedback, and we can do this together, rather than presenting something that looks really polished that just doesn't quite solve the problem, and having the user just go away and think, okay, well, these people just didn't get it, kind of thing. And so for me, that like the piece of paper is actually a super valuable way of doing it, even though it's a bit counterintuitive.
I love that. And that's it. It's true. It's so powerful. Like, I purposely make occasionally some diagrams. I'll make them during the meeting when we're having a discovery session. And I on purpose keep them a little bit ugly, exactly so that people don't feel bad to kind of hate on it. If I were to go back, spend a week, even if I didn't do much with that week, they would then perceive that, oh, okay, this person's now gone, and spend a lot of time, and I should tiptoe. Whereas I'll just be sharing my screen as I drag pretty little boxes on a PowerPoint slide or a Miro board, and just say, does this line up with what we're talking about? Or is this what might move us forward? Either to make sure I've understood the business context correctly, or when it comes to proposing something new. Um, I I really like that. And I want to touch on something else that you mentioned a little bit further up ahead. You said you were making sure you were building pilots, not proof of concepts, because you wanted it to be something that can scale later down the line. And I know proof of concept is a bit of a dirty word in the sense that too many data organizations spend too much of their time on POCs that just never go anywhere and often take a lot of time to get to that stage as well. But talk us through a little bit about that. What does that mean for you? And also, what is the distinction?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and there is a time and a place for proof of concepts for sure, right? But I think for me, the difference really is like it's something that you can leave running and it's going to add value. And that the next step would be to scale it up by incorporating, I don't know, another part of the business. Or, if we're talking like maybe, at Rhymes, what the business is we take in data from almost 900 data partners, sort of financial services data. So data that's relevant for asset managers, asset owners, those kinds of people. And so it's a lot of benchmark and index data, but it's ETFs, it's ESG, it's basically any data that you need to sort of be an asset manager these days. So my pilot might be on, a subset of those data sources, but in a way that's working and able to then, be providing value. And then over time, we could add more of those sources to sort of scale it up. And then I guess ultimately your next phase would be sort of standardization, where you're like, okay, this is the way we're going to do it for the whole business, kind of thing. But I think in order to do that, you need to be really quite disciplined, right? About it's really easy to build something quickly and think like, oh, I'll just fix that schema later, or I won't bother configuring, a nice looking view for this particular object because we're not using it today. And then you end up looking back and being like, oh shit, now I got all this sort of tech that I need to work through, right? So it's kind of a balance. You don't want to do a ton of work that's not necessary, but the more sort of production ready that you can do things as you go along, I find the easier that is in practice.
For sure. And would you say, because I think when someone hears, oh, it needs to be production ready, you kind of go, okay, then it maybe I need to add a 0 in terms of how many weeks of effort it's going to take. Is it always the case that it means you need to basically set a higher bar and say, you know what, we can't spend just 1 week on this. It needs to be 4 weeks so that it's production ready and scalable and so on. Or is it also about saying, well, instead of having a bigger POC, why not have a much smaller in scope, but production ready pilots? Is that how you see it? Is it a bit of both?
It's a good point, actually. I think both of those things could be potential, ways of doing it. But I also think the tooling that you choose makes a big difference, right? Like, if you get somebody to sort of, do some quick analysis in a Jupyter notebook and prove that, like, yeah, actually we can join these two data sets together, or I think there's some value if we do this. That's great, but that's a really long way from being production ready, right? Whereas if instead you do it in a tool, one of which might be founded, but if you build it properly in like Databricks, or, even if you were to build it, directly on the raw data, the real data in Azure, or wherever you have it, I think, it's much more likely to be easy to make it production ready. So I think it's sort of like, choosing your tools so that they're not just, experimental sandboxes that aren't ever connected to the rest of your business, makes it much easier to sort of do that in the long run. But
yeah, big time. For me, the other thing I've seen is kind of sometimes missing is also on the skill side of the people using those tools. Like, are they data scientists that have come from a more of a software engineering background, that triple Venn diagram of data science? Or are they more of a stats and business Venn diagram person? And so actually a lot of the things that it would take to make something productionizable or scalable is just not, they've literally not written the code like
yeah, that's just not their skill set, right? Yeah, and they're never going to think about what's the deployment story here, what's the testing story, like all that kind of stuff, right? Yeah, I think it comes down to having the right people in your team, right? And I think and the sort of, I do feel really strongly about the sort of forward deployed engineering style that Palantir and I guess a few others use now, where you really have the people it's not like I go and gather requirements and then lob them over the wall to the people to build it. It's like, no, we all go on site to the client, sit there at their desk, watch them be interrupted 57 times by their colleagues, look at all the post-it notes they have around, figure out like, oh, actually, this is really like a massive pain in the ass, this thing that they're trying to do. And this is why we're going to make it better for them. And this is why it's going to be valuable. And then you go back and you build stuff and you have that why. And so I think like really having the why is important, but also like you say, you kind of have to have the people who have the right skills, right? Like I might be able to like, build a nice data pipeline to sort of prove a concept, but you probably don't want me building the whole thing, at 100 million row scale because, I know PySpark, but I'm not an expert in how to optimize it and things like that, right? So it's important that you also have people working on it who are capable of making it production ready, right? So you kind of have to have a sort of multifaceted team.
I love that. And for me, this sort of way of working is one of the things that is, it's a, if not defining feature, it's one of the best examples I have of what is the distinction between, let's say, a project manager and a product manager working in a data team. And it's that siloing of responsibility. Like because I do the same as you, right? When we went to shadow the end users of a solution that we were building, it wasn't just me going, even though I could have gone there, gathered the requirements, asked questions, and I have enough technical knowledge to be able to ask the more technical details. But I was like, well, first of all, if I do that, then the rest of the team just exists in a vacuum where they just get some requirements from me. But also they're not living the problem. They're not feeling the pain, which is partly important for their motivation of like, why are we even doing this? So I'm just doing it because, I've come into work today and that's what I've been given to do. But also their brains are not working on solving the problem. It's just whoever's gathered the requirements initially that then goes, okay, I think this is how we're going to solve it. And maybe you get some feedback from your team. Like half the time, the actual solution and what exactly we're going to do to solve the problem comes from my technical team because they are part of those conversations and they...
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And they can be like, well, we could do this, but actually if we did it differently, that would then enable us to possibly extend it in these ways in the future. And then you think like, oh yes, that's actually a really good point. They've not asked us to do that, but that could be a natural extension or something like that, right? So you make better design decisions too, I think, if you get the people brought along for the ride.
Yeah, 100%. And also it's more interesting and fun. And at the end of the day, you move faster and you're more productive that way. So for me, it's the kind of thing that when I pitch it to someone that's not used to working that way, they're like, oh, but do we really need to, can we not shield the engineering team from all those meetings? I'm like, well, we could, but it would be worse. We would move slower and we'd have more of those situations where we build something, then we show it to the client. And then we realize that actually the past few weeks either were a total waste, or at least we should have done things in a much smarter way from the start.
Yeah. And like you say, it can be fun, right? I mean, like, I spent a lot of time on the final assembly line at Airbus, for instance, it's like, that's super cool, right? And like, there's not many people, I guess in the engineering space that wouldn't be interested in doing that, even if they're software engineers, right? Because it's a really interesting problem, right? Or, you end up sort of, in somewhere in the Midlands on some like military base, like seeing, just what it's like to actually, be on a military base in the UK kind of thing. And it's sort of like, it gives you that perspective in terms of why this is an important problem to solve kind of thing.
That sounds awesome. And what about, I guess, when you have people that have been hired into these like forward deployed engineer roles, they're used to working in that way. Have you had times when you went into a new organization or a new team that you had to kind of convince either the people in your team that this is the better way to work, or at least the clients that, hey, and I know it feels weird that there's 4 of us here, but bear with us. How did that go about?
Yeah, and I think even in some cases, convincing the client to not do the requirements gathering for you, right? Like I think like I worked with some clients, where they wouldn't even allow us to talk to the end users without them being present because they were worried that we were gonna, I don't know exactly, overpromise, show them something they shouldn't. We were going to build something outside the scope without their permission. I mean, these people were in the controls part of the organization of an investment bank. So like perhaps control was their issue. I'm not sure. And that was like super frustrating because like, it just takes longer when you obviously have to get somebody else to set up the meetings and you can't meet if they're not available and things like that. but you just don't get to as good of a solution either, right? And so I think like you just really have to be adamant that like, no, actually, like we really need to talk to these people. And you're right, we're going to bring along our 3 people because it's really important that they hear it, right? And then, for instance, when we went to Airbus, it was like you could literally talk to anybody you wanted. Like we could wander around the whole manufacturing site. I talked to people in, engineering and safety and flight test and manufacturing, like, and they were mostly engineers, so they weren't expecting perfection either. They were just expecting, something that was better than what they had today, which was very little, right? They're like, do I need to get a coffee while it loads? No problem, kind of thing, right? Whereas, the sort of controls people that I'd worked with previously were more like, if it's not 100% perfect, we won't consider rolling it out. And I'm like, okay, so that's not going to happen. But like, what would you roll out? We can't even think about that till the data's 100% perfect. I'm like, okay. So as you can imagine, that one didn't go very far. Whereas, Skywise is still a thing that, Airbus is using today. And they have like over 150 airlines connected. They have like nearly 12,000 aircraft sort of streaming back to data in near real time into the platform. And it's a huge success. And I think that's partially because of the approach that they took to it, which is just like, just let it grow organically and sort of let people find the valuable use cases. You've hired a lot of smart people, like let them actually be empowered to sort of change their worlds, right?
That's incredible. I remember learning about Skywise a few years ago when I was at Capgemini Invent, and it was part of our training because Invent were building on top of Skywise. And I was like, wow, this is one example of the whole vision of, what? You have data and it's all interconnected and you can actually make decisions about an end-to-end process with it. Not, we're paying millions for storing a bunch of data, but it's of such poor quality and no one has full access to everything and everything is a little bit of a mess. But I wanted to touch on what you mentioned earlier about the folks in control and how if it wasn't 100% perfect, then they wouldn't roll it out. Because it's a double standard I've seen quite a few times when people compare maybe what a model can do to perfection, but then they forget that the human being currently making that decision is far from perfect. And often, like, even if the model is not very good, if it's better than the human decision maker, a lot of the times it's like, well, why wouldn't you want that improvement? So do you have any tips for folks listening at home if that's the scenario? Like, how do you pitch that to convince someone to, hey, let's start with the imperfect and improve data quality and model quality over time?
Yeah, I mean, I think an iterative approach is great, right? And then what I was trying to get at when I was asking that question is like, okay, so if it was perfect, what would you roll out? I was trying to figure out like, okay, how do we start to prioritize, right? Like out of all your 57 data sets that are all terrible, which one should we start trying to make perfect, right? Knowing that we'll never get there, but they wouldn't even really get to that point. But I think you just, I mean, it's like you say, right? It's like you have to just sort of say to them like, yeah, but like you do this today and you're not perfect. This, I often like to use data to prove things, right? Like if you can get some analysis of the current situation, either anecdotally or like, some actual structured data to sort of prove that like, well, today it's 80% accurate, or today we spend a lot of time doing it manually and it's not perfect, then it usually sort of helps to sort of bring people up, along to your sort of side of the story, which is that, anything that's better than the human, or even if it's about as good as the human and it's faster or cheaper, then you should also be interested in it.
For sure. I feel like sometimes as data people, we kind of forget to take our own medicine because we're like, oh, isn't it obvious that this is going to be better? And it's only when you show, even if it's other data people, the actual numbers of, okay, here's the productivity figure in the BAU process. This is the prototype model. This is what we think it's going to be if we can improve XYZ data set, potentially convert that into hours of FT time that you might save or revenue that you might increase. And then suddenly you go from having conversation to something much more concrete and tangible. I know I'm guilty of it too. Sometimes until I see the numbers, I'm like, oh, I don't know. This doesn't sound that good.
Yeah, it's really hard to argue with numbers on a page, right? Like you look like a real idiot if you're studying in front of the group and the numbers clearly say we should do this, and you're like, yeah, but I don't think we should do it because of X, Y, Z. And it's like, really? Like, why? But I think you made a good point there too about like the storytelling about it, right? And like I think that's something that like data people often forget. It's one thing to put the numbers on the page, that's great, but being able to weave that into what matters for the business, and why this matters, and sort of then I guess tie it in sort of more anecdotally to a whole bunch of other things that you could do or other value. I think is super important, and I think it's something that I don't know. I don't know really know where you learn the art of storytelling, right? I mean, there's I've listened to a few podcasts and things like that, but it's definitely an area that I'm trying to improve in, because I think being able to articulate more the value of what we're doing is always going to be a good thing.
For me, I found working in consulting, and more specifically, working for consultants who would not hesitate to kind of give you tons and tons of brutal feedback. And every time I'd think, okay, you know what? This slide is now great. It's clear. It's concise. It's to the point. And then it would get shat on. I'd be like, okay, there's more to do there. And sometimes that felt like, oh, why is this person such a hard ass? But in retrospect, I'm so grateful for it, because it's through practice, but also feedback, that I got better at it. If I just practiced without the feedback, I wouldn't be able to get to it, because I wouldn't know what good actually looks like.
And probably now you can even do some of that in your head, right? You can sort of think like, okay, if I'm going to show this, if I was to show this slide to a fictional consultant, or colleague in this case, what are they likely to say? Okay, they're likely to say that this bit's missing, or I need to improve this part of the story or something.
For sure. Though I'd say still not as much as I'd like. Like sometimes, especially now that I don't spend as much of my time making slides as when I was in consulting, I find that, okay, I'll have times where I'm like, okay, I'm now a bit rusty and I need to actually go back into practice mode, because it is a skill, and like a lot of other skills, it kind of gets fleeting over time. But for sure, I'd say I do more of that back and forth in my head now than when I was in my early 20s. I wanted to touch on something else that you kind of alluded to earlier. So you were brought in at Rhymes to, I guess, lead something new for them. And I want to hear about that, and also in the context of maybe how have you gotten folks to adopt AI and adopt a relatively new technology and possibly way of thinking about things. And we can talk about it in the context of Rhymes or past clients, but I want to touch on that topic of adoption.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so I started at Rhymes as head of AI product last September, and so I've been there sort of 15 months now. And the goal was very much to use AI to make our products better. And so sort of think of it as like AI sprinkles on top of our existing product and product roadmap, rather than some totally new, we're going to become an AI company or something like that. So I've had to sort of work quite closely with, all of our, the product managers and the product owners. And I think we definitely we had a lot of appetite, from clients. And I've probably spoken to maybe more than 40 different clients now about, AI and what it could do for them, and their use cases and where they are on the journey. And what we've sort of seen is that there's a lot of appetite, but really very little adoption. And I think there's a few reasons for this. I mean, one, it's sort of a highly regulated, slow-moving industry in general, and so I think things take time. But also it kind of depends on the people that you're talking to. So in some cases, the relationships that we have are sort of in a different part of the organization that's not likely to be people that are thinking about innovating with AI because they're just busy doing their day jobs. Whereas some clients where we have sort of more of a higher level relationship, that's where you can have a really interesting conversation about the kinds of things that they're doing and that they want to do, and how we can help bootstrap them on their journey. And I think there was actually one client that I learned a super important lesson from, which was, our AI engineering team is quite small, and I've tried to keep us quite focused on, sort of doing the things that make our beer taste better, to quote Mr. Bezos. When somebody says to me, can you write me something that, parses these PDFs or summarizes this news or something like that. It's well, I could, but it's going to take a lot longer than you think to make it production ready. And it's kind of going to become commoditized. And we don't really have any unique IP here, right? You could argue that, certain kinds of unstructured data, there is a lot of, industry knowledge needed to sort of properly parse private asset data, PDFs, and there's tons of companies that are actually doing that. But in general, I really tried to stay away from doing stuff that was not sort of, our sort of bread and butter. And I spoke to this client, and they said that the first use case that they did was a news summarizing sort of co-pilot for their CEO. And so that when he came in the morning, he would have everything he needed to know about what happened, with their customers and in their industry and, competitors and things like that. And I thought that's super interesting because I would totally not do that use case because it's the kind of thing that's going to be in Teams in 6 months, right? Like it's just going to be like built in, right? So like, why am I going to bother doing this? And it's nothing that really uses any of their own, IP, right? They're a pension fund, like that news summarizing is not really their thing, right? But what they said was, sure, it'll be in Teams in 6 months, but we have it 6 months before that. So we have an advantage there. And it wasn't that hard. Like, they're like, it's not like we spent 2 years doing it. Like, I knocked it up in 2 weeks and then somebody else, productionized it quickly. But the most important thing was actually that it got the buy-in of the CEO and it got his attention and it was something that he cared about. And so they were able to deliver it, pretty quickly and easily. And will it become, replaced by something in Teams later? Maybe. But it did mean that the next project they went to the CEO with and said, hey, we need $2 million to do this thing. He was like, yeah, sure. AI is amazing. I totally get this. And so for me, it was a super interesting lesson in like doing things that you might not think actually are the right things long term because it gets you some executive buy-in. And I think that sort of ties into previous parts of our conversation as well, right? Is that like this whole idea of like, how do you get the buy-in is super important.
That's such a good point. And for me, it's an observation that's really worth repeating because especially as product people and we want to be at a more strategic level, we want to think more strategically. And I often have this debate as well where I'm like, we could do this, but is that a core competency for us or should we outsource it? Is it a distraction or will it help us? But then I was having a similar interaction with a client, very senior in the organization. It was a steer call about one of our projects. And when they talked about why they're now buying into AI and they want to roll it out across their organization, they said what was their kind of light bulb moment and why they stopped being so skeptical was because they started seeing their children use ChatGPT to solve their homework assignments. And part of my head was like, wow, like of everything, was that really it? It's not like
all the work I put into this project and that's what did it.
Yeah, and like, years of other machine learning projects that either we were doing for them or their internal data teams were doing. And it was like slightly discouraging in that sense. And then part of me was like, well, take what we can. And so now whenever people are like in our industry, Gen AI, it's such a hype, it's a bubble, everyone's excited, but for the wrong reasons. I'm like, yes, but they are excited, right? Now, if you say I work in AI, someone that previously had no idea what machine learning is, and it was, technobabble to them, now is like, well, how can I do that in my business too? So for me, it's that really important point that sometimes we do things for strategic reasons because we're going to build a competitive advantage in this way. And other times it's more tactical because we have a long-term vision, but how do we get there?
Yeah, but I guess in some ways it's tactics to affect the long-term strategy, basically, right? I mean, you're still trying to get to the same strategy, right? But yeah, and I think internally something that we have done is we've had a few hackathons internally at Rhymes with the idea being just to get people excited, right? And like one of our measures of success is like how many different functions is represented on your team, right? Because we want people to be not just working with their own sort of the people that work with all the time. But also, like, this year, I think it was a relatively junior team that was based out in Manila that used what we sort of built this Rhymes AI workshop, which is sort of it used Open Web UI, which is an open source thing that we found, which is sort of like it's basically a wrapper around Azure and OpenAI or other model, and it was pretty easy for we just sort of made it took out a lot of features, simplified it. Rhymes branded it and gave it to these teams. And this relatively junior team, on the other side of the world, managed, they did have one engineer and they managed to use the sort of, there's some tools functionality in it where you can basically like call any Python code you want. So they connected it into Datadog, to use it to answer questions about the client flows that they were monitoring. And they actually asked us halfway through the week, they're like, can we roll this out to the rest of our team? Because it's so useful kind of thing. And, when we were doing the judging, like there was 3 really good projects. It was really, really hard to pick a winner. And I thought, I think for the purpose of the hackathon, I want to reward, it's a cultural impact that we're trying to have here, right? Like technically, sure, we're going to build all 3 of these things because they're great ideas. But the team that I chose to win was the one that was, like I said, junior, non-technical on the other side of the world. And I felt like it was more important for them to win than it was for the team of awesome engineers who sit next to me who, yes, of course they built something impressive because this is what they do every day kind of thing. And so I think like that sort of, the buy-in from the other people in your org and sort of empowering people to make their lives better. We then took the tool down for a few weeks because, we had identified some bugs and things like that. And we got emails like every day from people being like, when is this thing going to be back? I need this tool kind of thing. And that was one way I thought was really interesting. That's only when you figure out how important your product is when it's no longer available, right? And everybody shouts. So that was, so it's still in use, and we're still using it to sort of prototype ideas. Obviously, if something is good, then we probably want to, build it properly rather than just let people sort of build it in their sandbox. But having that capability is just really a really cool thing.
That's super awesome. And 100% agree. Like, if you take something down and no one even blinks, you're like, hey, were they even using it before? Like, I've seen this idea.
That should be part of your plan, right? It's like every 6 months we just take it down for a week, and if nobody complains, then we turn it off.
Yep. I saw someone, it was like half joke, but half serious. They wrote an article being like, every dashboard you build in your organization should be self-destructing. That, if it just gets deleted after however long you want, 1 week, 1 month, whatever. And it's only when someone comes back and says, hey, where's this thing, that you bring it back, because you often have this sprawl of lots of dashboards and tables and data models and tools and whatever else. And you don't really know what is actually useful. So to have something that gets people calling you up and saying, where is this? I need it. I mean, for me, there is no better feedback for knowing this.
But
right they
so yeah, because the scene where they were kind of, they really didn't want to take it down. They were kind of sad, but then once they realized the demand, they were like, okay, this is actually really cool. People love our product. So
that's awesome. So for everyone listening at home, why not turn off whatever you've got running just to see the reaction? But this is not, professional advice. We're not responsible for getting you in trouble, depending on what it is that you take down.
Yes, obviously, select your use cases carefully there.
All right. Let's go to our flash round. So quick set of questions that I'd like to ask everyone in the show. First things first, what is a tool or technique that's helped you in your career? It can be very work related. It can be a little bit more tangential, but something that you'd recommend to folks.
So I think probably the one that I use the most is the old classic GTD framework by David Allen, the sort of idea of having all of your to-dos in one place, whether that's work or personal. And that actually is something that can be difficult depending on the constraints of your, the tech at your organization. And like, for instance, right now I have my personal and my work separated, and it drives me up the wall because I know how much more powerful it is to have it all in one place. But this whole idea of just write it down and then get it out of your mind, get to inbox zero, doesn't mean you have to do everything. It just means you need to flag it for later and have some way of getting back to that. And I love the idea of a start date, a future start date. Like, the list is really, really long, but if you don't have to do something this week, just make it pop up next Wednesday instead. And then today, when you look at the list, you only see what you need to do today. So, I mean, you do kind of have to be careful with this, because I do fall into the trap of like, what's the 6 easiest tasks I can do to make the list shorter? And probably some of my most productive days are the ones that I don't really even look at the list. But knowing that everything is captured on that list means that I know I can just quickly glance and see, is there anything that's actually due today? No, great. I'll go and spend 3 hours, actually doing some deep work, doing something else. So for me, the GTD book by David Allen was definitely one that's been hugely impactful.
Yeah, love getting things done. It feels like every productivity book that's been written ever since is almost a rehash of it, either intentionally or unintentionally. You might have the same answer to the next question since you picked the book, but is there a book that you would recommend in particular to folks who are data product managers?
I mean, I think I have a book that I would recommend to everybody, and it's a book called Surrounded by Idiots. And the title's hilarious. And it's really about how we all have different communication styles, right? And like, there's various versions of this, like the sort of red, the red type A's, the blue sort of analyticals, the yellows are the empathetic ones, and the greens are sort of everybody else who sort of just goes along with the flow kind of thing. And you do need a variety of people on your team. But I found it's just super interesting, first of all, to acknowledge that other people communicate in a different way to you. And then hopefully from there, you can realize that you need different strategies for communicating and, motivating different people. And it's really quite funny, the book. But it's a super, super important concept that I think everybody, data PMs or not, should read.
Love it. You're the second person this week to recommend it. I also think the added bonus is you can just take the book out in any context, and it's almost like you're making a joke, like, oh, I'm surrounded by idiots. And
Yes, yeah.
where can people find you if you want them to? Where's the best place?
LinkedIn's probably the best place. Maybe you can add the link in the show notes. But I'm Theo Bell on LinkedIn. Happy to hear from anybody who, wants to sort of talk about, I guess really the power of data models versus data, operational decision making versus dashboards. These are the things that I'm passionate about and I love to do in my spare time as well. So I'm a total nerd.
Awesome. I guess they can also find you at the London Data Product Meetup.
That's great. Yeah. And you sometimes as well, even now that you've moved away.
And I guess do you have any parting message for anyone listening at home on top of all the awesome things that we've just covered in the last 45 minutes?
I guess I'd just say have fun and keep learning. It took me a long time to realize that learning new things is what motivates me. And I generally find that in any situation, if I can learn something, then I'm happy doing it. But also, I guess don't forget to align your work with your values, right? Like if there is, if you're getting to the end of this year and you're thinking, yeah, I've been working my butt off, but like, why am I doing this? Like, take a little bit of time over the break and think about like what actually matters to you, and can you do something to make sort of your work more aligned with the values that are important to you? And maybe that's something you do in your spare time. Maybe it's, you carve out a few hours a week to work on a special project at work that, it is more rewarding to you. But yeah, I think just have fun. Life's short.
I love that. That's a great parting message, and especially for this time of the year, at least for me, this is when I do my kind of personal end of year review and reflect what's gone well, what hasn't, what do I want to do differently, what objectives do I want to set. It's a nice moment of reset for me. All right, Theo, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
I really, really enjoyed our conversation, and I can't wait for it to be live for everyone else to hear.
All right. Awesome. Thanks a lot, Nick.
Hope you have a good day. Bye-bye.
Cheers. You too. Bye.
Thanks so much for listening. Hopefully you got some great actionable insights out of this episode. We're so excited to dig deeper into data product management and its many facets. If you want to engage more with the show, you can follow us on LinkedIn and check out Soda's website at soda.io for more related content around product management in data. And if you are a practitioner bringing product management practices to data and want to potentially be a guest, please check the show notes for a link to apply. As always, we strongly encourage people from underrepresented groups in tech to apply. Much as I'm a handsome devil, we don't want all our guests only looking like me. So again, let's get excited for more digging into data product management in action.